You don't forget the sound the sky makes when it breaks. It's not thunder. Not really. It's deeper, hungrier. Like the earth itself just got punched in the gut and didn't have time to scream. That was the first sign. Before the lights, before the panic, before the screams. A low, vibrating groan that rolled across the oceans and up through the cities like something primal and very, very old had stirred awake. Captain Aisha Rahman was standing on the rooftop of an old UN observation post in Karachi when it happened. The city was quiet that night. Too quiet. You could hear the hum of neon signs a few blocks away, the occasional car horn. But even the dogs weren't barking. And Aisha, combat veteran, Special Forces recon, earthborn daughter of war and drought, knew that kind of quiet wasn't natural. It was the kind that wrapped around your bones and whispered, "Something's coming." Her comlink buzzed once. Static. Then again. Then all Skywatch posts report visual anomalies. Repeat. Confirm orbital reflections over southern horizon. Possible non-terrestrial activity. This is not a drill. Aisha's fingers tightened around the railing. Her eyes swept the black sky. At first, she saw nothing. Then the stars blinked. Just for a second. Just enough to catch it. A shadow, impossibly vast, sliding across the upper atmosphere like a stain across canvas. And then the world caught fire. It began with a line, razor-thin, brilliant white, lancing downward from the heavens. It hit the Pacific Ocean like the wrath of God, vaporizing water faster than the laws of physics like to admit. The blast was so bright it lit the night sky over Asia as if it were noon. The shockwave hit Karachi 12 minutes later. Windows shattered. Birds fell dead from the air. Aisha's ears rang like church bells in a war zone. Then came the real invasion. High above, the Krell Dominion emerged from the black, one by one. Not ships in the traditional sense, no sleek starfighters or gleaming saucers. These were living war beasts, kilometers long, crafted from bone, iron, and organic machinery, swimming through the void like predators that had never known fear. The first one descended over the Indian Ocean, tendrils trailing plasma, its body shaped like a cathedral twisted in a nightmare. It opened its maw, yes, a maw, and screamed. A psychic tremor rippled across the minds of every human within 1,000 kilometers. Some dropped to their knees. Some clawed at their own skulls. Aisha bit down so hard on her tongue, she tasted iron. But she didn't flinch. Within minutes, Earth's defenses came alive. Satellites fired their last desperate volleys. Scramjets scrambled. Drones lit up the upper atmosphere. But it wasn't enough. The Krell weren't just powerful. They were prepared. They knew how we'd respond. They anticipated every launch, every missile trajectory, every line of defense. And they cut through them like a scythe through wheat. Aisha raced down from the rooftop, boots pounding steel stairs as alarms howled across the base. The old UN outpost was coming apart at the seams. Sirens, screaming, scrambling. She stormed through the control room as her platoon tried to get bearings from dead satellites and jammed signals. "Get me eyes in the stratosphere," she barked, yanking off her helmet. "Where are they landing?" "They're not landing, ma'am," one of her sergeants replied, pale as snow. "They're burning their way through. Karachi, Bangkok, Sydney, contact lost. No comms, just static." Aisha closed her eyes for half a second. Not fear, just calculation. Battle instincts trying to process a war they didn't train for. She had seen insurgent hellholes, drone ambushes, guerrilla riots. She'd fought rebels in the Andes and terrorists in the ruins of Ankara. But this was annihilation on a planetary scale. This wasn't a war. It was an execution. And humanity wasn't ready. By the time the first orbital lance hit the coastline south of them, Aisha had already rallied her team. The 108th United Nations Marine Guards were a hybrid unit. Operators from 6 different countries, forged through blood and politics into one of Earth's only rapid response platoons. They weren't the biggest, the best armed, or the most funded, but they were stubborn. And right now, stubborn was the only currency that mattered. "We hold this line," she told them, as the tremors from the blast reached the city outskirts. "We don't let them take this ground without paying for it in blood. Not just ours, theirs." The sky outside turned orange, then red, then something worse, colors that didn't have names. Light twisted by energy that shouldn't exist. A black shape passed overhead, one of the Krell warbeasts, its shadow wide enough to blanket 5 city blocks. Screams erupted from civilians as gravity itself buckled. People collapsed in the streets, lungs crushed by pressure spikes. The ground moaned. Buildings twisted. And through it all, the Krell descended. They didn't drop soldiers. They birthed them. From their underbellies, living pods oozed downward like mucus-filled meteorites. When they struck Earth, they cracked open like eggs, and out came the monsters. Not humanoid, not mechanical. Twisted amalgamations of flesh, steel, and rage. Some scuttled like insects. Others leapt like wolves. Each was different, evolved for a specific terror. And each one hunted. Karachi erupted into chaos. Aisha and her squad met them head-on in the ruins of what used to be the financial district. Concrete rained from above. Flames licked the windows of half-buried monorail tracks. She moved like a force of nature, rifle bucking against her shoulder, her HUD screaming warnings in 3 languages. Sergeant Tanaka went down in the first wave, torn in half by a quadruped with saw-blade limbs. They couldn't even recover his body. Fall back to the transport hub, she shouted over comms. We make our stand there. Every block was a war zone. Every meter cost blood. They covered civilians with their bodies, with riot shields, with gunfire and grenades. One of the creatures barreled into their APC and flipped it like a toy. Another split apart mid-charge and birthed smaller versions of itself, like something out of a nightmare children weren't allowed to have. Still, Aisha didn't stop. She loaded round after round, her face streaked with ash and blood, refusing to back down. Not because she thought they could win, but because someone had to teach these things what it meant to fight a human, what it meant to earn the right to call this planet theirs. They wouldn't get it easily, not while she still drew breath. The transport hub was chaos. Fires, screaming, half the roof gone. Drones hovered overhead, spraying suppressant foam like rain. Aisha ordered her wounded inside, drew a line with her own body between the civilians and the incoming swarm. She turned her comm back on, patched into whatever was left of UN's Central Command. But there was nothing, just silence. No backup, no orders, no retreat. And somehow, that made it easier. She stood there as the monsters closed in, her rifle empty, her team battered and broken, her hands steady as stone. And she made her final call. All units, she said, her voice calm, collected. This is Captain Aisha Rahman of the 108th UNMG. Earth is under full-scale invasion. We are falling back city by city, inch by inch, but we are not surrendering. I repeat, we are not surrendering. Karachi is compromised, but we're still breathing. And as long as we breathe, we fight. There was no answer. But across the broken skies of Earth, in bunkers, outposts, shattered cities, and smoldering hillsides, those words echoed through dying radios, through ghost frequencies, through the hearts of every soldier, every refugee, every damn soul who still stood. Humanity wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Manhattan burned, not in the poetic, movie script kind of way. This wasn't a slow descent into ruin, with teary-eyed violin music playing as the skyline crumbled. No, this was fire and fury, immediate, brutal, and final. The kind of burning that made steel groan and glass boil. The kind that didn't just erase landmarks. It erased memory, identity, home. 46 hours after the Krell made first contact. If you could call planetary bombardment contact, Lower Manhattan was a smoldering, blackened ruin. The city that never slept had been silenced. Its voice snuffed out beneath ash and blood and the shriek of biomechanical monsters that didn't belong on any planet, let alone Earth. And in the middle of it all, trudging through the skeletal remains of streets he once knew, was Sergeant Miguel Torres. 20 pounds of armor on his shoulders, 40 on his back, a railgun tripod strapped to him like some rusted crucifix, dirt in his mouth, blood in his boots. He moved like a man caught in a dream, one that wouldn't let him wake up. But he wasn't sleepwalking. He was hunting. Around him, what remained of New York was quiet, too quiet. Not the calm kind, the other kind, the wrong kind. Fires crackled behind broken windows. Sirens wailed in the distance, their batteries dying out one by one. And somewhere, out of sight, something skittered across a rooftop with too many legs and no reason to exist. Miguel crouched beside a rusted-out taxi, scanning the street ahead. He wasn't alone. 10 civilians were huddled in the remains of a subway station 3 blocks away. Elderly, injured, terrified. He'd found them while clearing the West 14th Street underpass. They'd been trapped for nearly a day. No food, barely any air, and surrounded by Krell patrols sniffing them out like prey. He could have called in an evac, waited, tried for an airlift, but he didn't, because waiting wasn't an option anymore. The Krell didn't give people time. They didn't take prisoners, and they didn't knock twice. Miguel had a rule, forged somewhere between Kandahar and Kiev. If you can carry them, you save them. If you can't, you die trying. So, he wrapped his hands in tape, pulled on the straps of that railgun, and started walking. Now, he was almost there. He leaned into the radio clamped to his chest, voice a hushed whisper. Ghost call. This is Reaper 6. Approaching zone. I got eyes on the objective. No contact yet. But I don't like the silence. Static crackled. Then, copy. Reaper. Satellite sweeps down. You're flying blind. Expect company. Extraction route still hot. You got 30 minutes tops. After that, we lose orbital cover. Understood, Miguel replied, before muttering to himself, 30 minutes and a prayer. He didn't pray often, not anymore. But today felt like a good day to remember how. He moved through the debris like a ghost, eyes sharp, fingers steady. The railgun, though heavy, was his comfort, his old friend. He called her Maria. She was slow, clunky, loud, and only good for a dozen shots before the core overheated. But each one of those shots could punch a hole through 10 inches of alien armor and keep going. And right now, that was the kind of language the Krell understood. He reached the subway entrance. The civilians were still there, wide-eyed and scared, huddled beneath a flickering emergency lamp. An old man clutched a busted violin case. A mother held her toddler like a shield. A teenage boy, barely 16, stood at the edge, holding a rusted crowbar like it could stop death. Miguel dropped to one knee. Name's Sergeant Torres, he said softly. UN Marine Guard, Task Force Kismet. I'm getting you out of here. Stay low, stay close, and no screaming. Understand? They nodded, numb, silent, but they understood. He waved the boy over. You, what's your name? Isaac. The kid whispered. You're my second now, Isaac. You see something move, you tell me. No heroics, just eyes and legs. Isaac nodded, knuckles wide around that crowbar. Miguel pulled a flare from his belt and cracked it. Red light hissed to life. All right, he said. We're moving. Everyone now. They emerged onto the street like shadows pulling themselves from the grave. Miguel led the way, railgun ready, his eyes sweeping rooftops and alley mouths. The Krell were quiet today, but that only made it worse. It meant they were planning, waiting, watching, and they loved ambushes. They made it 2 blocks before the silence broke. The first one came fast, too fast. A blur of jagged limbs and pulsing metal. It slammed into a burned-out delivery truck and launched itself at the group with a shriek that didn't belong on any living thing. Miguel spun and fired. Maria's core screamed as the slug tore through the beast's center mass, splattering ichor across the street. Then the rest came. From above, from below, from the walls. Creatures of impossible design. Insectoid giants with tendrils for jaws. Serpentine horrors that moved like liquid steel. One of them dropped onto the rear civilian and snapped him in half before anyone could scream. The mother clutched her child tighter. Miguel cursed and laid down covering fire, buying the rest of them seconds. Move, he roared. Back into the lobby. There. They scrambled into a collapsed hotel entrance while Miguel and Isaac held the rear. The boy's hands were shaking. His crowbar trembled. Miguel crouched beside him. You scared? Isaac nodded. Good, Miguel said. Means you're still alive. One of the Krell lunged through the window. Isaac didn't think. He swung. The crowbar slammed into the thing's face with a wet crunch, sending it tumbling back through the glass. Miguel fired 2 more shots into the hallway, then slammed Maria down for a recharge. Nice swing. Isaac blinked. Thanks. Don't do that again. Next time, you run. The building groaned as if it were alive. Miguel knew they couldn't stay long. They had minutes, maybe less. His radio crackled again. Reaper 6, this is Ghost Call. You got inbound. Air support rerouted. Window closing fast. Miguel looked at the civilians, smeared in soot, bleeding, crying. Then he looked at Isaac, who was still gripping that crowbar like it was made of gold. No window, Miguel said. We're making our own. They kicked open the rear fire escape. Smoke rose in sheets. The air stank of melted plastic and blood. A distant roar shook the skyline. Something massive, far above, maybe a Krell dreadnought repositioning. It didn't matter. He moved with purpose, not fast, steady. Every step was a risk, every corner a coin toss. They passed the crushed remains of a fire truck. A woman's arm still hung from the door. Someone had carved "Help US" into the side, but the letters were smeared with something dark and dry. Miguel didn't look away. He couldn't afford to. They made it to the river 10 minutes later. The Hudson glowed like oil under the fires. Across the water, Jersey was smoking. The extraction point was a battered UN hoverbarge floating low and quiet against a pier. Marines waved them in, eyes wide as they saw how many had made it. All of them. The squad leader asked. Miguel didn't answer, just shoved the last civilian on board, then stepped back onto the dock. "Sergeant, what are you doing?" Miguel looked up at the burning skyline. Manhattan was still crumbling, still howling. Somewhere out there, more people were trapped, more were dying, and he couldn't stop. He turned back, voice quiet. "There's more inside. I'll buy you the time." Isaac stepped forward, but Miguel put a hand on his shoulder. "You did good, Isaac. Better than most." Then he walked into the fire. No music, no speeches, just the soft, rhythmic beat of boots against the ash-covered ground. He set Maria back onto his shoulder, slammed a fresh core in, and whispered 3 words to no one but the ghosts. "Let's finish this." You'd think the worst part of the end of the world would be the death, but it's not. It's the silence that comes after, the kind that settles over broken cities like a blanket soaked in dust, the kind that seeps into your bones, making everything feel hollow, empty, like something fundamental got knocked out of the universe, and no one remembered to put it back. That's where the world was now, staggering, numb, ruins and rubble and firelight. And somewhere beneath that silence, buried in the ashes of a planet still burning, there were whispers, echoes, ghosts, not literal ones, not yet, but close. The satellites were gone. Most of the major military command centers vaporized. Air traffic control, dead. Global internet, burned at the root. The world's once proud, humming communication lattice was now a frayed mess of static, panic, and long-dead signals bouncing around the ionosphere like broken prayers. But people are clever, and desperate people are even more clever. That's how the ghost channel started. Not by design, not by plan, just necessity. Ham radio operators, black market techies, civilian engineers in underground bunkers, and DIY hackers in Siberian basements. They patched together what was left of humanity's digital backbone with duct tape, rewired power cells, and 1,000 stolen parts. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. And from those whispers, a resistance began to take shape. Not a polished, top-down command structure, not a shiny new government, no presidents, no admirals, just people connected by pain, by rage, by purpose. The survivors started calling them the ghosts, not soldiers, not civilians, just humans with nothing left to lose. At the heart of this spectral network, deep in the ruins of Berlin, was a woman named Dr. Yara Kessler. She wasn't a fighter, didn't carry a gun, didn't wear armor. But make no mistake, she was one of the most dangerous people still breathing. Because Yara didn't fight with bullets. She fought with understanding. Before the invasion, she'd been one of the top xenobiologists on Earth, an academic buried in grant proposals and lab equipment. She'd studied microbial life on Mars, dissected Venusian spores in quarantine labs, and written a dozen dense papers no one had time to read. Now, she spent her days digging through scorched Krell corpses and half-functional Dominion tech like a scavenger in a digital graveyard. Because knowledge, in this war, was oxygen. And Yara had found something big. It started with a corpse. She'd found it twitching on the edge of the Brandenburg ruins. One of the Krell war beasts, the size of a city bus, mostly dead, but still pulsing with bioelectric signals. Her team had dragged it into the shell of an old opera house, laid it out on a cracked marble stage, and cracked open its skull. And that's when she heard it, not with her ears, with her mind. A hum, a resonance, a rhythm buried inside the Krell tissue, too regular to be random, too structured to be natural. A signal, pulsing across the biological network inside the Dominion beasts. It wasn't language, not in the traditional sense, more like a frequency of thought, a synchronization method. They were all connected. The Dominion wasn't just a species. It was a hive, a consciousness stretched across billions of alien bodies, syncing them in real time through living architecture buried inside the spires. Every one of those nightmare towers the Krell had dropped onto Earth wasn't just a fortress or a weapon. It was a brainstem, a cord spire. And if those spires were broadcasting commands across the battlefield, then there was a chance, just a chance, that destroying them could short-circuit the entire invasion. It wouldn't stop the war, but it might just tip the scale. Yara sent her findings out across the ghost channels like wildfire. The response wasn't immediate. Most units were still scattered, disorganized, struggling just to stay alive. But eventually, a new voice answered her. A voice from the embers of Karachi, Aisha Rahman, the soldier who stood her ground while the world collapsed. The woman who had made the first real stand against the Krell and lived to tell the tale. Yara and Aisha met digitally. Encrypted mesh transmissions bouncing between busted drones, jury-rigged towers, and old weather balloons repurposed as comms repeaters. They talked for hours, sending packets of data back and forth through ghost signals and battered networks. Yara explained the Cord Spire system. Aisha explained who was left to fight, who was willing, who was crazy enough to try. Together, they started building a plan, a real plan, not survival, not retreat, counteroffensive. They called it Task Force Kismet because fate, it seemed, had a strange sense of timing. It wasn't made of elite units or world leaders. There were no medals, no promotions, just fragments. French dragoons who'd survived the obliteration of Paris, Nigerian rangers who had fought street to street in the ruins of Abuja, Thai Marines who'd held the last fuel depot in Bangkok with nothing but knives and drone mines, Detroit street gangs who had turned abandoned auto factories into fortresses and figured out how to turn engine blocks into rocket launchers. They were broken pieces of a broken world. But when they came together, when they chose to come together, they became something more than just survivors. They became dangerous, unpredictable, human. The first full meeting of Kismet happened in the bunker beneath what used to be Warsaw, a candlelit war room filled with scarred maps, half-dead computers, and soldiers with thousand-yard stares. Yara stood at the front, chalk in hand, drawing crude diagrams on a scorched whiteboard. Behind her flickered schematics of Aspire's internal structure, stitched together from half-burned alien logs, battlefield scans, and her own obsessive analysis. This isn't just structure, she told them, pointing at a vein-like pattern snaking through the image. It's signal architecture, live data flowing through biological circuits. They're broadcasting commands from here to every Krell organism within 1,000 kilometers. Like a telepathic antenna? Someone asked. Close. Yara nodded. Think, a nervous system. This is the brain stem. Cut it. And the body spasms, Aisha finished, arms crossed, leaning against a battered filing cabinet. You said they had 8 operational spires still standing? Correct, Yara replied. But we don't need to hit all of them. Just one. A deep strike on the neural core could disrupt command signals long enough to destabilize the hive. How long's long enough? A gruff Marine grunted from the back. Yara looked him in the eye. 5 minutes, maybe 10. A heavy silence. Then Aisha stepped forward. Then we make those minutes count. Operation Cuckoord was born. A single spire. One strike. No backup. No reinforcements. Just Task Force Kismet. Patchwork soldiers with barely functioning gear, stolen tech, and whatever fight they could still squeeze out of their bones. But they weren't going in blind. They had intel, they had a plan, and most importantly, they had each other. Aisha's squad rolled out first, 6 armored transports retrofitted with Krell plating scavenged from old battlefield kills. Yara flew with them, crouched in the back of a gutted APC, clutching a makeshift data core wired into a power cell from an old water heater. It was the only device they had that could see the Spire's network in real time. Outside the vehicle, the world passed by in flashes, burned fields, shattered towns, forests blackened to cinders. Every once in a while, they passed a survivor, a kid, a farmer, someone half buried in rubble. And each time, they slowed, tossed supplies, passed notes, shared what little they had. Because the ghosts weren't just fighting to win. They were fighting to remember who they were. The spire loomed on the horizon 2 days later. It didn't look like a building, or a tower, or even a ship. It looked like something grown. A twisted, bone-white monolith crawling with alien moss and writhing heat vents. 6 kilometers high, constantly shifting, pulsing, breathing. Kismet stared up at it from a hilltop. You ready for this? Aisha asked Yara, checking the mag in her rifle. No, Yara said honestly, but I'm going anyway. Aisha smiled. Then you're already more human than half the people I used to know. And so, the ghosts moved, not quietly, not elegantly, but with purpose, into the ruins, into the fire, into the shadow of something ancient and terrifying. They weren't many, they weren't perfect, but they were human. And that, as the Dominion was about to learn, made them the most dangerous force left in the galaxy. It was supposed to be a salt mine. That's what the maps called it. Just a frozen strip of tunnels carved into the side of a Siberian mountain. Cold, forgotten, useless. But in war, useless places become priceless. No one bombs a salt mine. No one sends orbital lances to places no one cares about. And so, beneath the cracked glaciers and windswept peaks of the Urals, Task Force Kismet built their war room. Generators stolen from a dead solar farm. Tents strung up between mine carts and rusted metal beams. A single digital uplink powered by what used to be a nuclear battery from a weather satellite. It flickered every few minutes, like even it was holding its breath. And outside, ice. Just endless, unbroken ice. The kind that doesn't melt. The kind that doesn't care who wins the war. The mission was simple, at least on paper. Cord Spire 7, located near the old Russian tundra outpost of Vostok, was broadcasting control signals to every Krell unit across the Eurasian corridor. If they brought it down, they wouldn't stop the invasion, but they'd cut the brainstem. Just like Yara had said, that was the theory. But theories don't bleed. People do. Captain Aisha Rahman stood at the edge of the mine shaft, staring out into the white nothing, visor flicked up, breath crystallizing in the air. She hated the cold. Always had. Too many memories of ration camps. Shivering nights under canvas. Times when warmth was just another luxury someone else had already taken. But right now, she didn't have time to hate anything. She had 24 soldiers, 5 squats, 2 exosuits, 1 homemade recon drone they called Snowball, because it rolled like a bowling ball and had a habit of short-circuiting when it got scared. And ahead of them, through the whiteout, across 30 kilometers of wind and hell, waited a spire, a living fortress, crawling with Krell. They moved at dawn. Not that dawn looked any different in the Urals, just a slightly lighter shade of gray. Their boots crunched over hard-packed snow, their breath misting from rebreathers. The wind howled like something mourning the end of the world. The exosuit pilots, old veterans named Jean and Barkov, marched ahead, their servos whining with every step. Behind them, Yara walked with her portable scanner humming like a sleeping dragon. It was picking up pulses from the spire, like sonar from a creature trying to locate prey. "They know we're out here," she muttered, squinting at the glowing data strip. "They feel us." Aisha glanced back, voice low. "Good. Let them come." The ambush hit halfway through the pass. No warning, just snow erupting from the ground like a geyser. And suddenly there were Krell shock troops everywhere. They didn't roar. They didn't scream. They clicked, a horrible, rhythmic noise that made your teeth itch. Spindly creatures with razor legs, too many joints, and glowing sacs on their backs like tumors ready to burst. Miguel Torres was the first to fire. Maria, the railgun, shrieked once, twice, blowing 2 of the creatures into pieces that steamed on the snow. The squad behind him opened up with pulse rifles and flommers, carving swaths through the first wave. But it didn't stop. It never stopped. One of the things leapt clear over a barricade and drove a spiked limb through a corporal's chestplate. Another dropped from a cliff like a boulder, smashing an APC in half. Snowball the drone screamed and exploded, taking 3 of them with it. Aisha fought like a woman with nothing left to lose. She moved through the chaos with cold efficiency, plasma blade in one hand, sidearm in the other. At one point, she tackled a Krell berserker to the ground and drove her blade through its eye socket, snarling as the blood hissed against her armor. Yara took shelter behind a rock outcropping, her hands flying over her scanner's interface, trying to jam the enemy's signal. "Give me 30 seconds, she shouted. "You've got 10. Aisha barked, throwing a frag grenade into a clustered knot of limbs and fangs. The fight lasted 12 minutes. By the time it was over, the snow was no longer white. 4 of their own were down. 2 more too wounded to move. One exosuit, Barkov's, stood frozen in place, the pilot dead inside, chest crushed by a Krell brute. Jean walked over and placed a gloved hand on the fallen suit's shoulder. Didn't say anything. Didn't have to. They kept moving. The spire loomed ahead 2 hours later, taller than any skyscraper, its walls pulsing like lungs beneath layers of bone and ice. It hummed. You couldn't hear it with your ears, but your body felt it. In your teeth, your bones, your memories. The resonance made the world feel wrong, like gravity had turned sideways. Yara stared up at it, breathless. This isn't just alien. It's alive," Jean muttered, then let's kill it. Getting in was a nightmare. The outer walls were guarded by Krell sentries that looked like walking spiders made of obsidian and regret. Their eyes tracked motion. Their arms were blades, so they didn't go through the front. They went under. An old drainage tunnel, half collapsed, barely big enough to crawl through. Miguel led the way, dragging Maria behind him, swearing with every inch. The tunnel smelled like rot and bile and something older than death, but it worked. They breached the inner chamber undetected, and inside, it was like stepping into another world. The walls glistened with membranes and nerve-like cables. The air was thick, wet, every step squelched. Lights pulsed with no clear source. It didn't look like tech, but it worked like it, reacted to presence, shifted with movement, like it was watching. They made it to the neural core, a bulbous, throbbing structure that sat in the heart of the tower, encased in something that looked like bone glass. It pulsed with the same rhythm Yara had found in the dead Krell weeks ago. This was it, the brainstem, the signal tower, the heartbeat of the beast. Yara stepped forward with the gravitic imploder, Earth's nastiest little toy, built from repurposed gravity weaponry and wrapped in duct tape. She placed it on the glass, set the timer, 5 minutes, no turning back. And then, the spire woke up. Every light inside turned red. The walls screamed, not in sound, but in thought, pure alien rage. Krell poured into the chamber from all sides, bursting from holes and vents and cracks in the flesh steel. They were trapped, and there was no escape. Miguel took position on the high ridge. By her time, he roared, unloading Maria into the first wave. Jean powered up the remaining exosuit and charged headlong into the swarm, a living juggernaut. Every punch sent bodies flying. Every step shook the floor. Aisha fought at Yara's side, guarding the timer with the last round in her sidearm, then switching to a knife, then to her fists. There was no music, no glory, just steel and blood and fury. 1 minute left. Yara was screaming the countdown over the comms as Torres dragged a wounded squad mate toward the exit tunnel. 50 seconds. The Krell began to tear through their perimeter. 40. Aisha's leg buckled. One of the creatures had driven a shard into her thigh. 35. She staggered, then turned back toward the core. Miguel grabbed her arm. Captain, go. She shook her head. Someone has to make sure it blows. Don't. She looked him in the eyes. I have to. You know that. He didn't argue. He just nodded and ran. Aisha stood alone in front of the core as the creatures closed in, bleeding, breathing hard, but unbroken. She stared them down, looked death in the face, and smiled. Boom. The spire's heart exploded like a sun being born. Outside, the entire structure began to collapse, veins snapping, limbs twitching, metal screaming. Yara and Miguel dragged the survivors out just in time to see it fall. The neural pulse that had filled the air for days vanished, just gone. And across Eurasia, the Krell staggered. Their movements slowed. Some dropped dead on the spot. Others spun in place, confused, disconnected. The hive had lost its voice, and humanity had just found its roar. Later, they buried Aisha in the ice. No body, just her helmet, scorched and cracked, placed beneath a steel marker welded from a rifle barrel and an old UN badge. Yara carved 4 words into it with her knife. She didn't run, ever. And as the ghost channels lit up with reports of other victories, other spires trembling, one thing became clear. This wasn't over, but it was no longer a slaughter. Now, it was a war. Wars aren't just won on battlefields. They're won in the silences between orders, in glances traded across flickering terminals, in whispers behind bunker walls. And sometimes, they're lost there too. Because for every bullet fired in the name of survival, there's a knife waiting in the dark, one you never see coming. And it's not held by the enemy you know. It's clutched by the hand standing right behind you. After the fall of Spire 7, humanity did something it hadn't done in months. It breathed. The air wasn't clean. The skies weren't clear. But for the first time since Earth's atmosphere had been split open and poured full of fire, there was something close to hope. Krell units across the northern hemisphere stuttered, lost coordination. Some froze in place, twitching like puppets whose strings had snapped mid-performance. Others just wandered off, like they didn't know what they were. The Dominion still loomed. Yes, there were more spires, more war machines, more death to come. But humanity had punched back, had proven it could bleed the beast. Task Force Kismet became legend overnight. Their message echoed across the ghost channels like a battle hymn. The hive can be broken. The spires can fall. We are not done. But no victory ever comes clean. Because while the world celebrated, while soldiers buried their dead and prepped for the next strike. Someone else was watching, someone who shouldn't have been there. Miguel Torres had seen a lot of ugly things in his life. He'd fought in the wastelands of eastern Kiev, led refugee extractions during the Lagos firestorms, walked through camps where disease killed faster than bullets. But this was different, because this wasn't chaos. This was designed. It started with a signal. Buried deep in the recovered fragments of Spire 7's neural core, Yara had pieced it together over 2 sleepless nights, hunched over cracked servers in what used to be a school basement. Encrypted, alien, faint, but definitely not Krell, because this signal didn't broadcast outward like the others. It was going in. Yara stared at the pattern, her eyes hollow. It's not a command pulse. It's a response. Something inside the spire was communicating with something else. Another spire? Miguel asked, leaning over her shoulder. She shook her head. No, the frequency's wrong. This isn't Hive protocol. It's synthetic, human architecture. Miguel went still. What are you saying? Yara looked up, voice tight. I'm saying someone on our side was talking to the enemy. The word traitor hits different in war. It's not just betrayal. It's contamination. A virus in the bloodstream. Something poisonous that wears your uniform, speaks your language, salutes your flag, and sells your future for a whisper of power. And that kind of betrayal, that doesn't just kill you, it breaks you. Because when the world is already on fire, trust is the only shield left. They started the search that night, just the two of them, Miguel and Yara. Not because they didn't trust anyone, but because they couldn't risk being wrong. The Spire's logs, what was left of them, pointed to a burst transmission 6 hours before detonation. A type beam message, sent from within their own strike zone. Someone in Task Force Kismet had contacted the Spire before it fell, which meant they hadn't just betrayed the mission. They might have triggered the defense systems that nearly got them all killed. The list of possible suspects was short. There were only 37 active personnel in the strike teams that hit Spire 7. 10 were dead, 5 were critically wounded and under lockdown. That left 22. So they started there. The first clue came from a corpse. Private Lianzhou, recon specialist, died during the ambush in the pass, throat torn out by a Krell. His body had been recovered, tagged, and stored in a cryopod. But when Yara ran a bioscan, his implant showed post-mortem activity, which should have been impossible. UN forces used biometric tags that went cold the second your heart stopped. But shows had pinged the network after he was declared dead. A data burst, 17 seconds long, compressed. Miguel pulled the logs. Where was it sent? Yara's voice was barely a whisper. Somewhere beneath the ruins of Cairo. Cairo was long gone. The spire that fell there hadn't just killed the city, it had rearranged it, melted the skyline into a single fused glass crater. No life, no light. But now it seemed there was something else beneath it. Listening, they brought it to command. Colonel Lasker, leader of the European Front, scarred, stoic, practical. He'd been one of the first Ghost Channel supporters, back when most commanders were still trying to use broken satellite networks like they were prayer lines. He listened in silence, never blinked. When Miguel finished, Lasker just nodded. I want every survivor from Spire 7 under internal audit. Full psych and telemetry. Bring an Echo Division for silent monitoring. No interrogations. Not yet. Miguel frowned. We should confront them. Root it out. No, Lasker said. If there's a leak, you don't plug it with panic. You watch. You wait. You let the poison show its own face. Yara crossed her arms. And if they run, Lasker met her eyes. Then we shoot first. 2 nights later, the traitor slipped. It wasn't dramatic. No gunfire. No alarms. Just a missing signal burst from a maintenance drone. One that had been configured to recharge in the med bay. Next to injured comms officer Nils Dreyer. Dreyer was a tech. Quiet. Kept to himself. Good with encryption. Too good. Miguel followed the drone's telemetry. Found a relay node hidden behind a stack of decommissioned hardware. Not standard issue. Not ghost built. Something else. Inside it, a memory core, scrubbed, but not clean enough. And on it, the same pulse signature they'd found in the spire. Dreyer hadn't just sent information. He'd received it. They confronted him at dawn. He didn't deny it. Didn't run. Just looked at them like they were children. You think we're going to win this? He asked softly. You think they fear us? Miguel's knuckles went white around his sidearm. Why? Dreyer smiled. Not cruel. Just tired. Because survival is irrelevant when evolution is already here. Yara stepped forward. You gave them our positions. Our people died. They were always going to die, Dreyer whispered. But I will live. My bloodline will live. The Krell aren't just soldiers. They're the future. A perfect mind. A single will. No hunger. No war. No lies. Just purpose. Miguel hit him. One blow across the mouth. Not for justice. Not for revenge. Just because it was the only thing keeping him from screaming. They executed him that night. No ceremony. No court. Not because they wanted to hide it. Because they wanted it done. The war didn't have time for trials. And traitors didn't get last words. Later, Yara sat alone beneath a collapsed signal dish, holding the data Dryer had stolen. Encrypted messages, coordinates, biometric logs from every member of Kismet, location scans, strategy reports, all fed into the spires, all turned against them. Miguel found her there, eyes raw. She didn't look up. "It's not over," she said. "I know. There are more. I know." A long silence. "Do you still trust them?" she asked finally. "The others?" "No. Us. You. Me. This." Miguel took a long breath. "Trust isn't what saves us," he said quietly. "Choosing to trust anyway. That's what makes us human." And in the ruins of a dying world, among blood and frost and whispers in the dark, humanity made that choice again. To trust, to fight, to hope. Because the Krell could break bodies. They could burn cities. But they couldn't understand what it meant to believe in each other. Not yet. And that's what would kill them in the end. Sometimes, history pivots on moments you don't see coming. Not the speeches, not the grand battles, but the quiet ones. The decisions made when no one's watching. A hand gripping a rifle. A voice trembling over the radio. A look passed between two soldiers who know they're not coming back. That's where humanity lives, in those moments. And in the dying light of what used to be Sao Paulo, humanity made one of those choices. To stand. The city was gone, mostly. What hadn't been burned was broken. What hadn't been broken had been buried. High-rises lay gutted. Streets sagged with ash. The sky itself, once a humming, colorful canopy, hung low and gray, like the world had stopped bothering with color. But beneath the surface, buried in the bones of what was, a resistance stirred. They called it Bastion Zero, not because it was the first, but because it was the last. The last organized defense network south of the equator. The last place where you could find real intel, working vehicles, and a med bay that wasn't just a tarp and hope. And now, the Dominion was coming for it. They didn't march like armies. They flowed, came in waves, biomechanical, insectal, wrong. Not one species, but a collection of horrors engineered to break spirits as much as bones. The Krell didn't just want victory. They wanted obedience. And Bastion Zero refused. Miguel Torres hadn't slept in 42 hours. His armor was scorched. His knuckles were raw. He'd been running logistics, repairs, and fallback drills so long his voice had turned hoarse from shouting. But when the alert came, when the long-range drone feeds lit up with heat signatures boiling across the rainforest, he didn't blink. He just leaned over the map table, tapped his finger on the screen, and said, "We hold them here." Someone, young, shaken, too green for this war, asked, "For how long?" Miguel looked up. Long enough. They didn't have much. A few armored transports. 3 air drones, barely flight-worthy. Anti-air cannons salvaged from an old Brazilian Navy outpost. And people. That was the part the Krell never seemed to understand. People break. Yes, but not the way machines do. Machines shut down. People bend, rebuild, improvise, bleed, then keep walking. That's what Bastion Zero had in spades. Yara arrived at dawn, still shaken from Dryer's betrayal, still haunted by the blast at Spire 7. But when she stepped off the transport, she felt it, that buzz, the hum of something alive, something fighting. Miguel met her at the ramp. "You're late," he said, smiling despite the dust on his face. "You're bleeding," she shot back, nodding at the dried gash above his eyebrow. "Style choice," he muttered. She almost smiled. Almost. The plan was simple, not elegant, not brilliant, just necessary. Bastion Zero sat atop what used to be a maglev terminal, its tunnels stretching deep into the earth. A perfect fallback route, but only if they could hold the upper levels long enough to evacuate the civilians still sheltered below. 5,000 lives. One chance. If the Krell broke through before the tunnels were sealed, there'd be no one left to fight for. They prepped all day. Sandbags, turrets, EMP mines. Tripwire laced through broken escalators and hallways. Yara set up the pulse array, one of her last working recon devices, scavenged from Spire wreckage. It would give them real-time pings of Dominion signals, but it was fragile. One hit, and it'd fry like a bug under glass. They placed it on the roof of an old transit tower and waited. The first wave came at dusk. It started with clicks, dozens, hundreds, rattling through the buildings like infected wind. Then the howls, then the screams. The Krell burst through the tree lean like living fire, fast, low, multi-limbed beasts that moved like shadows and hit like hammers. Their armor gleamed black and wet, like something just pulled from a nightmare. But Bastion Zero was ready. The first perimeter lit up in a thunderclap of gunfire and fury. RPGs arced through the sky like dying stars. Drones screamed overhead, dropping thermal bombs into the thick of the swarm. Miguel manned the eastern wall, rifle locked to his shoulder, calling coordinates between shots. Yara crouched in the command tent, watching the pulse array, her hands flying across the interface. "They're coming in from 3 sides," she said, breath tight. "They're adapting faster this time." "No surprise," Miguel growled. "They learn. Then we'll teach them something new." For 3 hours, they held, wave after wave. Men and women who hadn't eaten in a day throwing grenades with their bare hands. Medics who hadn't seen the sky in a month dragging wounded to safety under live fire. Jean, one of the last exosuit pilots left, charged straight into a Krell brute the size of a tank and brought it down with a stolen plasma saw. One of the drones, nicknamed Skipper, flew a suicide run into a clump of aerial bioweapons, detonating midair to save the medbay. Losses piled up, but the line held, because no one here was just fighting to live. They were fighting for each other. And then, the spine arrived. Not a Krell, not exactly. This was Dominion Prime, a creature standing nearly 4 meters tall, with segmented armor that pulsed like a living organ and claws that vibrated at subsonic frequencies, capable of cutting through reinforced bunkers like butter. It walked slowly, deliberately, straight through the eastern barricade like it wasn't even there. Gunfire bounced off its skin. Flamethrowers only made it angrier. And behind it, Krell shock units. Dozens of them. Yara saw it on the feed and didn't hesitate. She grabbed the railgun Miguel had once nicknamed Maria's brother, an experimental prototype built for anti-spire shots, and sprinted to the southern tower. "Where are you going?" someone called. "To end that thing before it ends us." She reached the tower in under 4 minutes. Set up the railgun on what was left of the observation deck. She could see the spine clearly now, advancing on Miguel's position, carving through the defenders like they were paper dolls. She synced the targeting lens, charged the coil, but the circuit started to flicker. Battery drain. Too much output. 1 shot. That's all she'd get. She took a breath, whispered something that sounded like a prayer but wasn't, and pulled the trigger. The gun didn't fire. It screamed. A blinding flash of light tore across the battlefield, arcing into the spine's torso. And in that instant, just a second, the air went still. The creature stopped. Its chest glowed white-hot, then cracked. The pulse wave shattered every window within 10 blocks. The spine dropped to its knees, then fell. Silence for maybe 5 seconds. Then cheers, laughter, life. But it didn't last, because that final shot, it fried the pulse array. Yara's feed went dark, and suddenly, they couldn't see. No more tracking, no more signals, just instinct and sound and faith. Miguel called out across the ghost channel. "All units, Phase 3. Evacuate now. Get the civilians underground. Leave no one behind." The final defense was now a sprint, a race, against time, against numbers, against extinction. They moved fast, bleeding, broken, still fighting. Families shoved into maglev lifts, children carried by strangers, soldiers dragging one another down collapsing corridors. Miguel stayed at the back, holding the final door, firing into the approaching dark until his rifle ran dry. Then he picked up a pipe and kept swinging. Yara found him just as the blast doors began to shut. "You're coming with me," she shouted. "I'll slow them down." "Shut up," she said, grabbing his vest. He stumbled in beside her, just as the steel doors slammed shut with a boom that shook the earth. And behind them, only blackness. Bastion Zero had fallen. But the people, they had escaped. Thousands. Safe. And for now, that was enough. Later, in the emergency chamber, someone handed Miguel a radio. The ghost channel was lit up with chatter. All across the world, other bastions, other survivors, were repeating one phrase, over and over. "Sao Paulo stands." And in the dark, in the silence that followed, Miguel smiled. Because even if the walls had crumbled, even if the streets above were ash, something deeper had survived. Not stone, not steel, but spirit. There comes a point in every war where the rules stop mattering. Lines blur, Promises fray. The difference between right and wrong becomes a shadow and smoke. And all that's left is survival. But humanity's always been good at that. Too good, maybe. Because when the sky started burning, our sky, it wasn't the Krell who lit the match. It was us. 3 days after Bastion Zero fell, the Ghost Channel exploded. Not with retreat calls, not with funerals, with intel. Yara had intercepted something deep inside Dominion data fragments. A ghost of a ghost, hidden in low-band encryption buried beneath battlefield telemetry. It pulsed like a heartbeat under static. At first, she thought it was just noise. Then it started forming patterns, coordinates, orbitals, trajectories. She decoded it at 3:42 a.m., eyes bloodshot, hands trembling, teeth clenched like she already knew what she was going to find. And she was right. They weren't just targeting cities anymore. The Krell had found Argos, humanity's last deep-orbit defense satellite. The final piece of orbital artillery still capable of punching holes in a Dominion warcruiser. It had stayed hidden until now, operating on cold protocols, silent, masked by debris fields and misdirection pings. But the Krell had triangulated its position. The signal confirmed it. They were sending a shard fleet to erase it. Yara stood in the dim glow of the command room, the data file shaking in her hands. If they destroy Argos, she said quietly, we'll never get control of Earth's orbit again. They'll own the sky, and when you lose the sky, you lose everything. It wasn't just a weapons platform. It was a lifeline. 100 self-sustaining war drones, 3 antimatter cannons, and an experimental kinetic rail designed to hit targets from space. That was the plan, the fallback, humanity's ace in the void. But if the Krell reached it first, game over. No more ground-to-orbit strikes. No more Overwatch for Bastion remnants. No more way off this rock. And just like that, the war wouldn't be about freedom anymore. It would be about how long we could breathe before the air ran out. Miguel didn't hesitate. We launch, he said. Yara blinked. We don't have a fleet. We don't need a fleet, he growled. We just need one ship, one crew, one shot. Do you know how many people have tried to breach a Krell shard fleet? Do you know how many people have tried and cared? She paused, and then she nodded. The ship they found was a rusted wreck from the early colony wars. The Icarus Queen, more scrap than steel. A forgotten hulk floating in the exo-junkyards of Sierra Ring, half covered in ice and wrapped in cables like spider silk. It hadn't flown in 20 years. It had no AI, no shields, no working FTL, but it had a launch bay and a spine rail chamber, and room for one last stand. They got to work. For 40 hours, the crew of 6 barely slept. They rerouted fuel lines, reprogrammed guidance nodes, cannibalized a dead mining rig for jump thrusters. Yara manually recalibrated the targeting array using a soldering gun and pure rage. Jean installed a spinal mount cannon made from 2 different weapon systems that were never supposed to talk to each other. Miguel? He was everywhere. Welding, lifting, loading, leading. He didn't inspire with speeches, just presence. When someone faltered, he was there. Quiet, steady, the kind of calm that only comes from standing in the mouth of hell and not flinching. They launched just before sunrise. No fanfare, no countdown, just a hiss of ignition, the groan of old metal, and the sound of a ship that was never meant to fly, rising from the bones of Earth like a phoenix made of scars. The Icarus Queen tore through the upper atmosphere like she was angry to be awake. The Krell picked up the launch almost immediately, and the race began. The Shard fleet was already in Earth's orbit. 20 Krell vessels, sleek, black, covered in writhing antennae and neurospikes that glowed like venomous veins. They weren't built to transport. They were built to hunt. Argos was less than 45 minutes from being overrun. Miguel stared at the main display, watching red dots converge. Set course for intercept, he said. Yara looked up from her console. That'll take us right through the Shard fleet. He nodded. Exactly. The Queen didn't dodge, didn't weave. She charged headlong, guns blazing, a screaming corpse of a ship defying everything the Krell thought they knew. The first enemy vessel fired a plasma lance. It scorched half their wing. The second unleashed a horde of drone things, metal locusts with scythe arms and no sense of mercy. Jean jumped into the belly turret and started laughing. Come on then, you freaks. Let's dance. He lit up the swarm with a flak burst that turned the void into a fireworks show of death. Yara rerouted auxiliary power to the spinal rail. It needed 6 minutes to charge. They had 4. Miguel took the helm himself. The AI was fried. Autopilot was guesswork. So he flew manually, through debris, through fire, through gravitational spikes that made their teeth rattle. He moved like he could feel the ship breathing, like it was alive, like it was his. They breached the Shard Fleet interior ring with shields down to 3%. Hull integrity was screaming, but they were in, and Argos was in sight. The Krell flagship was bigger than anything humanity had built in 30 years. It looked like a crescent made of bone and iron, bristling with tendrils and energy siphons. It had already locked a tractor beam on Argos. Seconds from boarding, Miguel shouted, "Target the main siphon. Fire the rail." Yara hesitated. "The charge isn't complete. We don't have time." She gritted her teeth. Flipped the switch. The spinal rail fired, and the shot ripped the dark clean in half. The flagship exploded in 3 stages, first a light flash, then a soundless shockwave, then a blinding flare that ruptured half the Shard Fleet's command signal. Krell ships spiraled out of formation. Argos went dark for 5 long seconds, then blinked green. Alive, operational, ours. But victory never comes cheap. The Icarus Queen was bleeding. Internal fires, power loss, oxygen down to 30%, and more Krell were converging. They didn't have enough juice to jump out, not enough thrust to maneuver. They were done. Yara slumped in her seat, smoke curling from her console. Miguel looked at the cracked windshield ahead, where Earth floated like a blue whisper in the distance. And he smiled. "We did it." Jin's voice crackled over the comms. "So, what now?" Miguel leaned back. "Now we burn the sky." He pulled the emergency override on the antimatter shell. It was never meant to be used. Not in atmosphere, not even in orbit. But it would cook the rest of the Shard Fleet in one shot. Turn the Queen into a funeral pyre bright enough to blind the stars. Yara looked at him. He looked back. They didn't say goodbye. They just understood. The last transmission from the Icarus Queen came exactly 14 seconds before detonation. It was 5 words, spoken calmly, steadily. A whisper carried through static. "Earth still owns the sky." Then silence, and then light. From every bastion, every hideout, every resistance node across the planet, they saw it. A streak across the night. A second sun, blooming behind the clouds. Miguel's star. The Queen's fall. And the death of a fleet that thought Earth would surrender her sky without a fight. They wrote his name on shattered walls, painted it on broken tanks, etched it into knives and helmets. Torres, not because he saved the world, but because he reminded them it was still worth saving. By now, humanity had learned to survive the monsters. The Krell, the twisted, towering, biomechanical things. Yes, they were terrifying, but at least they made sense. They came at you with teeth and claws and the promise of death, wearing their violence like a uniform. But traitors? Traitors smiled at you first, and that's the thing that always gets you. The Icarus Queen had been gone for 5 days. 5 days since Miguel Torres lit up the sky. 5 days since a man chose to crash a dead ship into a living war fleet just to give humanity one last shot. He became a symbol, a martyr, a name whispered in every trench and rally point. But symbols can't lead, and people still needed a plan. That left Yara. She didn't ask for the weight, never wanted the title. But now, every eye turned to her. And when she spoke, people listened, because Miguel had believed in her. And belief like that, it echoes. She set up operations in Bastion Delta, an underground fortress buried beneath the Andes, built inside the skeleton of an old power plant. It was cold, damp, always humming with residual energy, and something about it felt off, like the walls had secrets. The first thing Yara did? Locked down the network. After Dreyer's betrayal and the near loss of Argos, she didn't trust anything with a blinking light. Every comm signal was monitored, every uplink scrubbed, every old archive reviewed line by line. And that's when she found it. A code trail. One that hadn't been flagged during initial scans. Subtle, inactive, buried behind old protocols, but unmistakably alien. Another breach, and this one was inside the Bastion. She traced it for 3 nights. Didn't sleep, barely ate, just sat in front of a rusted console, staring at a digital ghost moving through the wires. It was mapping their defenses, logging personnel, recording evacuation routes. But it wasn't broadcasting out. Not yet. It was waiting, like a fuse, unlit. And she had to find the match. There were only a few people with the clearance to even access those systems. Less than a dozen. And one of them was Captain Elias Forn. War hero, former fleet intel, decorated 3 times for service during the New Berlin breach. His name was Gospel in the Resistance. And that's exactly why Yara didn't trust him. Because in war, the loudest patriots are sometimes the quietest knives. She met with him in the command bay, beneath flickering lights and the constant echo of generators. He looked the same as always. Sharp uniform, clean-shaved, eyes like polished steel. "Something bothering you, Commander?" he asked smoothly. "I found a leak," she said flatly. "Old encryption, hidden protocols, buried deep in our core systems." He didn't blink. "Could be remnants from Dominion surveillance." "Could be," she nodded. "Unless someone let them in." Silence, then a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Careful, Yara. Paranoia is a slow poison. So is betrayal," she said. And for a second, just a flicker, his gaze shifted, like a mask cracking. She didn't have proof. Not yet. But she knew. The next step was dangerous, but necessary. She activated Protocol Echo, a ghost loop simulation that would replicate network behavior and trigger any latent outbound code. If someone had planted a beacon, it would light up. And it did. 17 minutes into the simulation, the signal didn't just ping Earth. It reached high orbit, straight to a Dominion relay node disguised in a dead Russian comms satellite. Someone in the Bastion was feeding intel in real time. Not stolen, shared. Yara went to Colonel Lasker immediately. The old man was harder than titanium, but even he looked shaken. "Elias?" he asked. "You're sure?" "No," she admitted, "but I have enough to move." Lasker nodded once. "Then do it quiet. Do it clean." But nothing about this war stayed clean. The takedown happened at 0400. 2 strike teams. Non-lethal loadout. Yara led the charge herself, her rifle heavy in her hands, not because of its weight, but because of what it meant. Vorn's quarters were silent. Too silent. No alarms. No struggle. When they breached the door, he was gone. Terminal still warm. Room swept clean, like he'd known they were coming. They sounded the alert. Bastion lockdown. Every exit sealed. Power rerouted to security. But it was too late, because Vorn wasn't just a traitor. He was a plant, a Dominion asset embedded years ago. Too deep, too well connected, waiting. And now, he was active. The explosions hit 10 minutes later. Not large enough to destroy the Bastion, just enough to fracture it, cut off power to the uplink towers, cripple the launch base, blind their radar arrays. Panic spread like gas in a closed room. Yara barked orders, sprinted to the command center, rerouted emergency subsystems. But even as she stabilized one node, 2 more failed. It was like chasing shadows in the dark. And then, the final blow. The Dominion had found them. A Krell dropship broke orbit, headed straight for Bastion Delta. ETA. For hours. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a setup. Vorn hadn't just sabotaged their systems. He'd lit a beacon for the enemy. And now they were coming. To finish the job. Yara didn't panic. She didn't cry. She got to work. They still had partial comms. Still had ground teams. And still had the most important weapon of all. Time. For hours. To regroup. To rearm. To rally. It wouldn't be enough. But it would have to be. She gathered what was left of the leadership team in the hangar. 20 people. Tired. Scared. Some injured. All looking at her like she was the last light left in the world. She looked them in the eye. "All right. We're not going to survive this." Silence. Not shock. Just silence. Because they knew. "But we're going to fight anyway. Not because we want to. Not even because it's the right thing. We fight because we don't let them win. Not like this. Not here. Not again." Someone asked, "What if we hold the line?" Yara smiled. Then she laughed. "If we hold the line, then maybe, just maybe, they'll remember us." The final hours passed in a blur. Old sentry bots were rebooted. EMP mines set across the approach corridors. Turrets cannibalized from transport decks. One last firewall written by Yara herself. A nasty bit of code designed to fry Krell cyberlinks the second they tried to interface. When the dust settled, there was just the wait. Yara stood alone at the main terminal, watching the horizon flicker. The dropship entered visual range. Dark, monolithic, a scar in the sky. And beneath it, dozens of Krell, claws sharp, guns loaded, hearts non-existent. She closed her eyes for just a second, thought of Miguel, of the Queen, of the sky burning in defense of Earth. Then she opened them again, raised her rifle, and said softly, "Let's dance, you bastards." The battle wasn't clean. It wasn't fair. But it was human. They held them at the choke points, used every trick, every trap. The Krell lost time, lost coordination. They weren't expecting resistance. And in the final moments, when the reactor began to overload and Bastion Delta started to collapse, Yara made her choice. She stayed, pulled the detonation core from the reactor, walked into the main chamber, and faced down the last Dominion advance. Face to face, gun in one hand, trigger in the other. No surrender, no retreat, just one last stand. The blast lit the mountain from within, tore through the Krell, wiped the relay beacon, and silenced Bastion Delta forever. But the Dominion didn't get what they wanted. They didn't get the win, because Yara made sure they burned too. Days later, the message hit the Ghost Channel. Short, fragmented, scarred, but clear enough to read. Bastion Delta compromised. Enemy inside. Self-destruct initiated. Core assets secured. Mission complete. We make our stand. For Earth. For Torres. For each other. And across every resistance cell. Every hidden base. Every soldier still breathing under a shattered sky. They didn't mourn. They prepared. Because now they knew. The monsters could bleed. The traitors could fall. And humanity? It wasn't done yet. Not even close. The world didn't end with a bang. It ended with a silence so deep, so absolute, that it felt like the very heartbeat of the planet had stopped. For a moment, Earth held its breath, and all of humanity did too. The blackout came without warning, a sudden pulse of electromagnetic fury that washed over continents, turning off every light, every signal, every spark of electronic life. No satellites, no radios, no radar. Even the sun seemed to dim, swallowed by the unnatural twilight of a world cut off from its own pulse. It was a weapon designed not to kill, but to freeze, to hold the survivors hostage in the dark. In the fallout of Bastion Delta's destruction, scattered bands of resistance struggled to regroup. Survivors hid in ruined cities, underground caves, dense forests. Everywhere, people clung to scraps of hope. But the blackout, whether Dominion weapon or consequence of war, had turned hope into a whisper. Miguel Torres was somewhere in that dark. No one knew where. He hadn't been heard from since the Queen's final transmission. Some said he'd died in the explosion. Others whispered that he'd escaped to fight another day. Either way, his absence was a wound in the heart of the resistance. And yet, in the silent nights, his name was a prayer, a promise. Yara stood on a crumbled rooftop in what was left of Buenos Aires, staring at the empty sky. No drones, no ships, no lights, just stars. Cold, indifferent. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering not from cold, but from the weight of it all. "We're alone," she whispered. But even in that solitude, she could feel the world holding its breath, waiting. The blackout wasn't just a blackout. It was a pause, a breath held, a calm before the storm. Because somewhere, deep beneath the silence, something moved. In hidden bunkers and forgotten tunnels, old servers began to flicker. Arcane machines from another time, designed to survive any collapse. They hummed back to life, and with them, a message. Simple, clear, urgent. System reboot initiated. All units, prepare for Phase Omega. Survival protocol active. Yara received it just as she was about to give up. She stared at the screen, disbelief turning to fire. Phase Omega, she repeated. Last-ditch plan. They didn't know what Phase Omega meant, only that it was humanity's final protocol, a code for the worst, a call to arms for the last stand. The resistance scrambled. From every corner of the planet, fighters, engineers, medics, and scavengers answered the call. No radios, no satellites, but ghost channels, encrypted, decentralized, almost mythical, carried the signal. Slow, fragmented, but alive. Miguel's voice crackled over the static. Bastions fall. Survivors rise. We don't stop. We don't surrender. We burn brighter. The words spread like wildfire, like the roar of 1,000 souls refusing to fade. The earth itself seemed to respond. Rivers swelled. Mountains stood taller. Skies cleared. Not from science, not from technology, but from something older, something primal. In the shadow of this awakening, humanity made a choice. To stop running, to stop hiding, to stand. The resistance gathered in the ruins of an old spaceport outside Santiago, once a hub of commerce and hope, now a crucible of defiance. Here, Yara found faces she hadn't seen since before the war. Wounded, weary, but unbroken. "We fight," she said. "Not for victory, not for glory, but for tomorrow." The plan was desperate, nearly impossible, but it was all they had. They would take back the skies. They would retake Argos. And then, with the last orbital cannons, rain hell on the Dominion's heart. They moved like ghosts, silent, swift, unrelenting. Each strike hit with the force of a thunderclap. Miguel led a team into the shattered city. His eyes burned with a fierce light. Every step was a promise, every breath a prayer. They fought not just with weapons, but with every scrap of will they had. One night, under a fractured moon, Miguel and Yara stood shoulder to shoulder on a ridge overlooking a Dominion stronghold. Explosions bloomed like deadly flowers below. "We're close," he said. closer than we've been in years. But the Dominion was no longer just a force of war. It was an idea, a creeping shadow in human minds. Fear, doubt, hopelessness. And so, the battle wasn't only fought in ruined streets or burning skies. It was fought inside every soldier's heart, inside every whisper of despair. Yara looked at Miguel, and in his eyes, she saw the same truth. That even if the world ended tomorrow, even if they lost everything, they would never lose this. Their spirit, their will, their humanity. And as dawn cracked over the mountains, the earth stood still once more, waiting, watching. Because when humanity decides to burn bright, no darkness can hold it back. There comes a moment at the end of every battle when the world feels unbearably quiet, a silence that hums louder than any explosion, louder than any gunshot. That's when you know the final chapter is beginning. Earth was bleeding. Cities lay in ruins. The sky was torn apart by scars of war. But in the midst of destruction, something unbreakable glowed beneath the ashes. Humanity's last light. The resistance was gathered at the ruins of what was once a sprawling spaceport near Santiago, where hope had nearly died, where dreams had turned to dust. Now, it was a crucible, the place where the final stand would be made. Miguel and Yara stood among the crowd, faces streaked with soot and sweat, eyes burning with exhaustion and determination. They had been through hell. They had lost everything, but they were still standing. The plan was simple. Too simple, some said. Too dangerous. They would launch a coordinated assault on the Dominion's main fortress, the place where the invaders had anchored their command ship, where the war could be ended or lost forever. Yara looked around at the fighters, soldiers, scavengers, engineers, people who had become warriors simply because there was no other choice. She saw the weight they carried, the ghosts of the fallen, the fear of the unknown, and yet, their spirit shone like a beacon. Miguel stepped forward. He didn't give a speech. He didn't promise glory. He just looked each person in the eye and said, "We don't fight because we want to live. We fight because we must. Because if we don't, there will be no future to fight for." The assault began under a sky smeared with smoke and fire. Artillery rumbled like thunder. Jets screamed overhead. And on the ground, humanity poured forward like a river swollen by storm. The Dominion was brutal, relentless, but the resistance was fiercer. Each inch gained was carved with blood and grit. Every fallen comrade fueled the fire in the hearts left standing. Miguel and Yara fought side by side, their movements synchronized, a dance born of years of hardship. He covered her flank as she took out a cluster of Krell snipers. She tended his wounds as he pulled him from the rubble. The battle stretched on. Hours melted into days. Time lost meaning. Only the fight remained. At the heart of the fortress, the resistance breached the command core, a massive chamber humming with alien technology, pulsing with power. Yara connected to the mainframe. Her fingers danced across the controls, bypassing firewalls and corrupted code. She sent a virus designed to cripple the Dominion's network. Systems faltered, lights flickered, shields dropped, the invaders faltered, and in that moment, humanity struck. The final wave surged forward, soldiers yelling, weapons blazing. The Dominion command ship began to crumble. Explosions tore through its hull. Miguel led the charge to the bridge. Inside, Dominion commanders looked shocked. They hadn't expected the fight to reach them. He stood tall, rifle raised, and fired. The battle was over. The Dominion retreated, their forces scattered like shadows fleeing the dawn. But the victory was bittersweet. So many had fallen. So much was lost. Yet, in the quiet aftermath, something powerful bloomed. A new dawn. Yara and Miguel stood on a hill overlooking the battlefield, the sun rising over a scarred, battered earth. They looked at each other, tired but unbroken. "Is it really over?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "No, not yet. But this is our last light. And we'll fight to keep it burning, because that's what humanity is. Not just survivors, not just warriors, but a light in the darkness, relentless, unyielding, unstoppable." And as the world began to heal, one truth echoed louder than any gunshot. Humanity's story was far from finished. It was only just beginning.